For the very kind and warm invitation and the very nice introduction. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about Sayyid Jamal, and one aspect that I would like to emphasize in particular is his background and his training in the Irfan, and how it sort of inspired and led to developing sort of modern forms of Islamic activism. So I will provide a brief overview of the life and career of Sayyid Jamal, Al-Asadabadi, also known as Al-Afghani. I mean, I put it in inverted commas. I mean, when we were sort of planning the lecture, I mean, because in academic discourse, I mean, all the publications obviously refer to him as Al-Afghani, and Shaykhi was always saying Asadabadi. So we already had a sort of conflicting use of the name. So for the purpose of the lecture, I will just talk about Sayyid Jamal, or Sayyid Jamal ad-Din. But again, it's part of his reputation, part of his sort of activism and how he presented himself to different audiences. He is obviously one of the most prominent Muslim activists of the 19th century. Again, I want to explore in particular his sort of training in sort of traditional Shi'i scholarship and his particular interest in Irfan and how it relates to his political activism. Within the 19th century, in the Iranian context, the most prominent expression of Islam was the so-called of Irfan was the so-called Shaykhi School. So I will talk a little bit about his relationship to the Shaykhi School, and again, talking about the connection between his sort of mystical and philosophical interests and his prominent role as an anti-imperialist Muslim activist. I want to raise also some sort of more profound question of his sort of lasting influence in the creation of modern forms of Islamic activism. Now, when we want to understand a figure like Sayyid Jamal ad-Din, we need to understand the particular context in which he was placed and the events that he encountered that shaped his particular approach to modernizing, reforming Islam. And of course, when we talk about the context in which he was placed, is the rise of European imperialism in the 19th century. I mean, what we see from the mid-19th century onwards, a momentum of European colonialism in the Middle East and North Africa and other parts of the Muslim world. I mean, I'll just throw some dates at you, some sort of significant events which show how, if you like, European colonialism took hold over many parts of the Muslim world and how a person like Sayyid Jamal ad-Din responded to these particular events. So we have in North Africa the French conquest of Algeria. We have the establishment of British rule in India following the so-called Indian Mutiny in 1858. Until then, at least nominally, India was ruled by a Muslim dynasty. So again, a change of power. A Muslim ruling dynasty was replaced by European colonial powers. We have the French conquest of Tunisia in 1881, and later on the British occupation of Egypt in 1882. So again, for an observer, for, if you like, a politically engaged Muslim thinker, intellectual activist, these events happening within a few decades were alarming. And again, there's a strong sense in Afghani, and many of his contemporary Muslim reformers, that the traditional Muslim elites, the political leaders, and, if you like, the traditional, scholars failed to respond to these new political realities, the actual threat of European colonialism appropriately. Very often, the political elites in Muslim majority societies were more or less willing to cooperate, to collaborate with the colonial powers, saw that as a way to retain their elite status, their status of power. And the traditional religious scholars very often lacked, if you like, the intellectual, the cultural means to respond to this challenge appropriately. And of course, in this sense, Sayyid Jamal ad-Din is quite significant as being one of the first who responded to this new situation, to this challenge, and whose influence stretches up to the contemporary period. Now, what is quite striking, I mean, we talked about the different nisbas that are used, and again, because he's such a prominent figure, I suppose everybody wants to have a little part and piece of him, and so on. Of course, he was also playing with his identities. I mean, it's very clear that he had an Iranian background. You know, people suggest, you know, he represented himself in the Arab world in the context of the Sunni Ottoman Empire deliberately as an Afghani, as a Sunni Muslim, in order to avoid potentially sectarian tensions, you know, to be more sort of acceptable as a kind of pan-Islamic, you know, universal Islamic reformer. But what is also quite interesting about the life of Afghani is a certain restlessness. And that's why I put this map. I mean, it's a bit anachronistic because it's a contemporary map, to show, or to give you at least some indication of all the places where he's been. I mean, he was traveling around the Muslim world, he was traveling to Europe as part of the activism. He'd never really stayed for more than a couple of years, and sometimes a few months, at one place. Partially because he was perhaps a bit restless and felt, you know, I need to respond to European colonialism, and nobody's really, you know, moving, nobody's really responding to it. But the other reason is he also, I mean, he was, or he must have been quite a charismatic figure, quite an appealing figure, you know, winning the trust and confidence of people, but he also managed to antagonize people because of certain things he said, in particular because of his critique of, if you like, indigenous Muslim political elites for their failure to respond to the challenge of European imperialism appropriately, and of course his critique of, you know, traditional ulama for the lack of engagement with modern ideas. So, I mean, he was born in Asadabad in Iran, you know, moved to Qazwin, to Tehran for his training. He moved to Najaf to continue his training. Again, there are all sorts of stories around his experience there in Najaf. Some people suggest that he didn't complete because he antagonized the kind of clerical establishment in Najaf in particular. Again, there are all sorts of stories and some myths around it. I mean, one of the themes that around Afghani that emerges very often is, you know, apart from his very strong charismatic personality, you know, he's a great orator, great speaker and so on, but apparently also had a certain messianic aura. I mean, there are always stories that either he claimed to be the Mahdi, or at least some of his followers believed that he is the Mahdi. So again, there are stories that he was sort of kicked out of Najaf because he claimed to be the Mahdi, or people believed to be the Mahdi. Others say, well, it wasn't as dramatic as these stories suggest. It was more because of his rather sort of unconventional intellectual interest. I mean, he was particularly interested in philosophy, in irfan and so on, and that was not sort of well recognized within the clerical establishment in Najaf. Others say he wasn't very popular there because he was quite lax about following Islamic rituals. So again, he's always portrayed as a very controversial figure who sort of swam against the stream, who provoked certain people, maybe deliberately, involuntarily, and who challenged views that were held by the majority of people. He went to Afghanistan, Herat at that time. He went to India, which was quite a significant experience there. He was in Istanbul for a couple of years. He was in Cairo. Again, I'll talk about this in more detail later on. So again, you can see he was sort of active in all the major cities of the Muslim world at this time, connecting with very influential people. He was in London, sort of lobbying against British colonialism, British imperialism in the Muslim world. He was a few years in Paris, publishing a journal. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about this later. He was in Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg, again, to meet influential intellectuals, journalists, to meet politicians, to find ways to forge alliances to counter European imperialism. So again, this is just sort of to illustrate a little bit the kind of restlessness of his life, the fact that he traveled a lot. And I think it might say something about Sayyid Jamal's personality, sort of one thing. The other aspect, because he moved around quite a lot, you know, he was, in a sense, in all the major places of the Muslim world at that time, and perhaps this created a sense of Islamic unity. I mean, he experienced Muslims of different backgrounds that obviously shared a certain sense of frustration with the state of Islam at that time, the threat of European colonialism, and perhaps the fact that he moved around and met Muslims in India, in Afghanistan, in Egypt, in the Ottoman Empire, created a sense of Islamic unity, which is quite an essential element in terms of his own teachings. Yes, I mean, the map just sort of to illustrate a little bit the restlessness of his life, to give you sort of an indication of all the places he went to. Again, it's impossible to give sort of a complete outline of his life, his biography, his various activities. So I'm just going to highlight a few sort of important stations. Obviously, his early years are quite significant. Again, he received initial training as an alim in Iran, and in terms of his own family background, the kind of education institutions, the houses that he attended, he was apparently particularly interested in irfan and its most prominent 19th century expression, the Shaykhi School. I don't know how familiar you are with the Shaykhi School. Again, it's sort of an early 19th century movement in 12th Shia Islam. The founding figure is Sheikh Ahmad al-Asai. And what he tries to do is to combine the diverse and rich intellectual traditions of Shia Islam, or of the whole Islamic tradition, together. He wants to sort of create a synthesis of the various, often competing, conflicting strands of Islamic intellectual history together. So, obviously, as a 12th Shia, emphasizing wilaya, the belief in imama, as a sort of central component, but he's also strongly influenced by Sufi ideas, Ibn Arabi, the notion of the perfect man, the idea that there is on earth in creation always one person who is the link, the connection between God and creation, the perfect man, if you like, the qutb, the pole of the universe. He also is influenced by sort of rationalistic philosophy. Ibn Sina tries to bring this on board, and of course also emphasizes training fiqh. So again, an effort to bring together all these different strands of Islamic intellectual thoughts and heritage into a synthesis. I mean, there's not really a contradiction between them. They all ultimately lead to the same goal. And I think this kind of intellectual outlook is quite important. I might come back to this later on, in terms of, I mean, if you sort of trained in an intellectual environment that says, well, whether it's philosophy, whether it's irfan, whether it's Isna Ashari, they all lead to the same goal. There's no contradiction between these different sources of knowledge and these different, if you like, intellectual approaches to acquire knowledge. If you're trained in such an environment, it is perhaps easier to accept sort of Western knowledge, Western science. Say, well, if I can read Aristotle as part of my philosophical training, why can't I read 19th century European philosophers? Why can't I engage with sort of modern science and see how we can appropriate that as Muslims in the contemporary context? I mean, I'll come to that later on, hopefully. Again, scholarship on Sayyid Jamaluddin would argue that his stay in India had a profound impact on him. Again, it's still not entirely clear how it all happened and what he encountered, but obviously he was in India at around the time of the so-called Indian Mutiny, or its immediate aftermath, and the time when sort of British colonial rule was firmly established in India. So maybe after that, maybe exactly at the time, and of course at that time there were sort of many revolts, rebellions by various religious groups. Sikhs, for example, rebelled against the establishment of British colonial rule, and there were various Muslim revolts by various groups against British colonial rule. So he saw that. I mean, until then, I mean, there was sort of nominally a Muslim rule in India, but of course most of India was controlled by the East India Company, which was sort of private enterprise that began to colonize India. And the Indian Mutiny was basically, or as it's called in Indian historical writing, the first war of independence. It's a kind of British perspective to call it the mutiny, sort of soldiers, Hindu, Muslim soldiers, working for the East India Company, sort of undertaking a mutiny. It's kind of very sort of Eurocentric British perspective. Again, in Indian historical writings, known as the First War of Independence, so the first revolt against British colonial rule. So there was a mutiny which failed, was crushed, and British rule was firmly established. So, in a sense, people argue that this sort of Indian experience made Afghani aware, Sayyid Jamaluddin, I was planning to refer to it this way, Sayyid Jamaluddin aware of the danger of European imperialism, in particular British colonialism, and its impact it has on, if you like, not just Muslim societies, but sort of non-European societies more generally. There's also the argument that in India he had his first encounter with sort of modern European philosophy, modern science. We don't really know much about this, in which context it emerged, what kind of impact it has. Again, we might speculate that maybe somebody like Sayyid Jamaluddin, who had this sort of open, perhaps unconventional intellectual outlook, he was more willing to engage with these ideas than others. Again, he moved around. I mean, he was very good, Sayyid Jamaluddin, to make connections with very influential people who sort of introduced him to other influential people. I mean, that was sort of one of his particular strengths. But also, because of certain ideas he put forward, he managed to antagonize people. And, was a controversial figure. I mean, he gave a sort of very controversial lecture, and again, in a kind of a modern sort of institution of higher education that was established by the Ottoman Sultan's Darul Uloom in Istanbul, which was controversial, again, at least for sort of a mainstream Sunni audience. Maybe for other audiences it wouldn't be that controversial, because he compares prophets with philosophers. I mean, he sort of diminishes the distinction between prophets and philosophers as individuals that are intellectually gifted, that receive particular knowledge from God, that have different approaches towards the truth, but ultimately lead to the same truth, which sort of ideas he adopted from Ibn Sina. He was then for a couple of years in Egypt, and in a sense, these were perhaps his most productive years. Again, he was involved in all sorts of political activities. Again, he was very much so kind of a political person and so on, and of course saw the immediate threats of sort of British control over Egypt. So he attacked again the political elites, the rulers of the ruler of Egypt, tried to sort of organize opposition to politicians, the political elite that was willing to collaborate with the British. But although these things didn't really materialize, I mean, Egypt was occupied by Britain in 1882, perhaps these are the most productive years because he established a circle of disciples that would later become very influential Muslim reformers, Egyptian politicians. I mean, one figure I'm going to talk about a bit later on is Muhammad Abdu, who obviously met Afghani in Egypt, became one of his closest disciples, but also other figures that would later on, in the early 20th century, play an important role in Egypt's struggle for independence, such as Saad Zaghloul and so on. They became part of his disciples. And again, he was a figure, he motivated these people to become politically active. He played also a very important role in promoting the sort of emerging Egyptian public sphere. So, this time, 1870s, early 1880s, we have, the emergence of newspapers like Al-Ahram, other newspapers, and he encouraged people to be involved in these activities, to write articles about political, social issues and so on, again, to create sort of new platforms to talk about, if you like, modern ideas, recognizing that, traditional means to disseminate ideas did not work. And again, in terms of the circle of disciples he had in Egypt, yes, prominent people, Muslim reformers like Muhammad Abdu, but also he was working with Jewish intellectuals. Al-Ahram was founded by two, Syrian brothers, Christian brothers. So I mean, again, he was working with various people in these various endeavors. Again, I'm sort of skipping certain things, just sort of highlighting, if you like, the most important elements of his career. His experience in India, again, people say it instilled in him a strong hatred for the British, but certainly an acute awareness of the perils, the problems of sort of European imperialism. And again, he was a political person looking, well, who could oppose the threat and the real threat of British imperialism in the Middle East and in the wider Muslim world. And of course, in the European context, the main rival of Britain was France. So he was in Paris, trying to forge or win sort of French support for an alliance that would also include Russia, kind of another sort of rival of Britain, and also that would include the Ottoman Empire, to forge a kind of French-Russian-Ottoman alliance against British imperialism. And again, the reference to the Ottoman Empire was important to him because that was sort of an example of, the last remaining sort of independent imperial power in the Middle East that perhaps could withstand European imperialism. But also, Afghani was aware of the kind of symbolic capital of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Sultan, who obviously also claimed to be the Caliph of Islam, the successor of the Prophet Muhammad as leader of the Islamic Ummah. And although Ottoman sultans might have carried this for whatever reasons as part of the title, it became sort of more pronounced in the late 19th century. And again, Afghani was somebody who supported this because he felt, there's kind of a political power that has symbolic capital that could be utilized to counter European imperialism. He published a journal together with his disciple Muhammad Abdu al-Urwa al-Wuthqa, it's a Quranic term, the firmest bond. And again, the Ottoman Sultan, the Ottoman Caliphate was seen as al-Urwa al-Wuthqa, the firmest bond to which Muslims should cling to achieve Muslim unity. And these articles, again, this was published there, sent to intellectual scholars across the Muslim world. And these articles, particularly the one, it was sort of a magazine talking about political development, sort of revealing the mechanisms of British imperialism, offering, the Ottoman Caliphate as kind of a counterweight to European imperialism. But the articles, the sort of more philosophical articles are addressing, the educated elite of the Muslim world. If you've seen them, they're written in the most eloquent Arabic. Extremely difficult, extremely sophisticated Arabic, very, very difficult to read, to translate, and so on. So again, using also Arabic and sort of to, obviously, a sort of unifying language, but also addressing in particular an educated elite across the Muslim world. And what these articles do, emphasizing Islamic unity, they present Islam for the first time in a modern context as an anti-imperialist ideology. People have referred to it as sort of Pan-Islamism, sort of Islamic universalism. So arguing that within an Islamic context, ethnicity is secondary. If you're Iranian, if you're Kurdish, Turkish, Arab, all these sort of ethno-linguistic national markers of identity are irrelevant. The first reference point, the first marker of identity is the Ummah, the Islamic community. So there's a kind of conception of the Ummah as a political entity, as a religiously, Islamically defined nation. So again, sort of Islamic unity, kind of an Islamic understanding of nationalism as a counterweight to sort of ethnic, linguistic forms of nationalism. Again, arguing, for example, that these various forms of nationalism that began to emerge in debates of intellectuals in the 19th century were part of a colonial plot to undermine Islamic solidarity and Islamic unity. So suddenly Iranians began to be proud of being Iranian, Egyptians saw themselves primarily as Egyptians and so on, Turkish national identity emerged, and again, the articles in Al-Wuthqa sort of presented as part of kind of colonial plot to undermine that the belief that ultimate allegiance should belong to Islam and the Islamic community. What Afghani, Sayyid Jamal was hoping to achieve with his journal was obviously to mobilize the intellectual political elites, to achieve unity, to fight against British imperialism. I mean, that didn't really happen, but nevertheless, the way how he conceived Islam in the articles of this journal would have a lasting impact on modern Islamic discourse. Again, the later years of his life, again, traveling a lot, again, he was sort of working for sort of political activism, trying to get, the Tsar of Russia, France and the Ottoman Empire sort of together to forge an alliance against British colonialism. Right. So as we can see, we have with Sayyid Jamaluddin a figure, very restless, a political person involved in sort of seeking to create alliances, maybe a bit too idealistic, optimistic at times in terms of what he could actually achieve, working as kind of an anti-imperialist Muslim activist. So what I'm trying to do now is kind of to have some sort of assessment of him and sort of look at, well, what is his impact? I mean, again, he was certainly in the 19th century an important and pioneering promoter of Islamic unity against European imperialism. Again, conceiving for the first time Islam as a kind of anti-imperialist ideology that should unite Muslims to fight against European imperialism. And this kind of discourse that is very strong in the articles of Al-Wuthqa would have a lasting effect on 20th century Islamic discourse, Islamic political discourse, and I mean up to the present, one can say. So although his immediate goals were not really fulfilled, people didn't read it and united and fought against British colonialism, but in terms of creating a particular understanding of Islam as a unifying religion or ideology against European imperialism, this is obviously something, and I don't need to tell you that had a lasting impact on 20th century Muslim activists and so on. The other sort of lasting impact is, and I mentioned this earlier, that he was a teacher and mentor of very influential Muslim reformers. I mean, Muhammad Abduh, one of the most influential, 19th century Muslim reformers. We wouldn't have Muhammad Abduh if it were not for Sayyid Jamaluddin. He was the one, and I'll talk about this in a minute as well, who encouraged Abduh to become politically involved, again to write articles in sort of the emerging sort of Egyptian press, and to become politically active as well. And other people that he sort of trained and mentored in Egypt were similar, encouraged to become politically active. So although again he might have failed in sort of achieving his immediate goals, in terms of the kind of generation of reformers and thinkers he created, certainly a lasting impact. Now, there is a certain ambivalence around that. I mentioned already, these different names he has and he used and how he played with different identities and the rumors that he claimed to be the Mahdi or people believed him to be the Mahdi. So, there are all these kind of controversies around them. Obviously, some might just have been put into the arena by his detractors, people who didn't like him, who wanted to undermine him and say, well, he claims to be the Mahdi, or, again, of course, this is sort of part of all these political games. He had a very strong elitist approach, which again is probably, and we want to understand where he's coming from, part of his training in irfan, which obviously is an elitist tradition in Islam. I mean, not everybody can become an arif. Not everybody can become al-insan al-kamil.